go about managing to increase the biodiversity for parish councils and for communities. And we're very grateful yet again to have the funding from Natural England who are supporting these webinars. So just a little bit of housekeeping first. Please, if you have questions, do write them as we go along. And please use the question and answer rather than the chat. Then also Lucy is going to put in the chat the link to our website and our email if you want to join up with the Nature Recovery Network. I should also just say that after the last webinar, we were approached by about 4 parish councils asking us if we could help them sort of set up a nature recovery network in their own parishes and villages. So if anybody else is interested, obviously there's a limit to what we can do, but we can just tell you what we did in terms of this local bottom-up network where within a village there are people who know things, who can support people who want to do things and also support the parish council. So do also put in the chat if you if you'd like some, well, mentoring, as Stan Lake put it the other day when they emailed us. And then finally, if you think that it would be useful to have more of these webinars, do please also let us know, and any particular topics that you might be keen on hearing something about. So without much more ado, I'm going to introduce my old friend, Reg Harris, who's going to give us the most amazing talk. He's spent 30 years being a tree surgeon for parish councils, town councils, forestry commission, but he's also a specialist and a kind of passionate ancient tree person. And so he's going to tell us, I think, how we can do all the health and safety stuff, but also keep our trees for wildlife and for us as well. So over to you, Reg.
Thank you, Kat. Yeah, good evening, and thanks very much for having me. I thought I'd just start by just explaining a little bit about myself and my background, and how I kind of got into all this, and how I have a little bit of experience and knowledge about working with trees, and also how working with old trees has led me to change how I work with what we could perhaps call conventional trees in a more conventional setting than some of these sites where these old trees are. So I started my career at a place called Ickworth Park in Suffolk as an arborist, working for the National Trust in the sort of mid-ish 80s. And immediately I was surrounded by loads of ancient trees there, and this being one of them, which is the Tea Party oak. It's a 700-year-old oak, and I was really, really drawn to this tree as well as the others in the park, because I really felt a sense of connection with the tree and all the things that lived in it and on it and around it, and the amazing effect it kind of had on the people that visited it, as well as the biodiversity that it supports. So that was kind of my introduction to it, and it has become a lifelong passion. And I'm very lucky that a proportion of my working life now involves working with ancient trees, but it still is only a tiny proportion compared to the majority of the work that I do as a conventional arborist. I started my company after leaving working for the National Trust in the early 90s, and we're an Arboricultural Association approved contracting company based just outside of Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. As Kat was saying, we work for a wide range of clients over the years, and next year is our 30th year that we've been in business. As Kat said, we work for a lot of local authorities, county councils, parish councils, domestic clients, and also organisations like the Forestry Commission, who are now called Forestry England. Still work for the National Trust and still work at Ickworth, amazingly. But also people like the RSPB, as well as the church. So here's an example of one of the sort of conventional sites we work on, using cherry pickers and things like that to prune trees over roads. That's the majority of the type of work that we do. But we're very fortunate that, as I said, we work for the RSPB, and through a number of years of experience of working with ancient trees, we're now working very luckily at Sherwood Forest and care for this tree, which is the major oak. It's an 1100-year-old oak tree, which is thought to have been the tree that Robin Hood hid in approximately 800 years ago. I'm going to say allegedly hid in, and it's just a fantastic example of an ancient oak. And just recently, just literally a few Saturdays ago, I fulfilled a lifetime's ambition of climbing the tree and carrying out an aerial survey of the tree for the RSPB. So kind of my life is complete. But my experience from working with ancient trees really stemmed from originally having an association with the National Trust, from who I first worked for in my teens. But not long after our business established, I started working for them at a place called Hatfield Forest in Essex, which is literally a stone's throw from Stansted Airport. Now, Hatfield Forest is really famous in ancient tree circles, and also because Professor Oliver Rackham described it as probably, without too much of a stretch of the imagination, as the best preserved example of a medieval hunting forest in the UK, and if not the world. It's full of ancient trees, as you can see examples here in the foreground and the background. And why I'm interested in it is because many of these trees had their tops cut off, their pollards. They were pollarded in their early life, and they became what we call working trees. So from the points where they were cut, which is about 2 meters above where animals could browse them, branches grew, and the branches were used for things like fodder, firewood, and construction. Whilst the National Trust owned the property, they noticed that in the 1970s that many of these trees became lapsed, and the tops stopped being cut on them about 150 to 200 years ago, when other industries were burgeoning and coal was being used more and things like that. So their products no longer became useful to people, and so they became lapsed pollards. And what was happening to them is the tops, as they grew, and they grew sort of top heavy, and also as they decayed, large pieces were falling out of them and crashing to the ground, and in some cases tearing large pieces out of the trunk, which led to the demise of some of the trees. So the Trust in the 1970s decided to repollard a load of these trees and do it in one go. And by doing it in one go, cutting right back to that 2 meter point, they cut all the tops of the trees off. And unfortunately, this had a devastating effect in the fact that many of the trees died. In fact, 90% of them died. This tree here, which is a hornbeam pollard, is one of the ones that didn't die, and it's quite a famous tree at Hatfield. And you'll notice it's kind of looks like it's in two halves. It hasn't split. In fact, the centre died and fell out gradually, but these two sides of the tree are really, really strong, and it's still continuing to produce lots of leaves and branches. And is probably, we don't know exactly, but I think it's thought to be 600 to 700 years old. Where my interest in these trees really developed was because 20 years ago, after all these problems with the trees dying from being cut, a report was written about the trees, and through new ideas that were coming through the Ancient Tree Forum, it was decided that an experimental tree pruning program would begin, and the trees would be cut in a different way over a number of years, and in fact a number of decades. And that's where, through doing that type of work, we've learned loads and loads of new things about ancient trees, not just in how they grow, but also what biodiversity they support. And it's this that I want to talk to you about tonight, and also tell you how the things that we've learned can morph over into conventional arboriculture, and particularly if you have trees that you might manage or care for. I'm going to give you a few tips and ideas of things that you can do with trees to manage them for wildlife later on. So why are ancient trees important? And I'm sorry if I keep talking about them, but it really is important because there's so much to learn from them, and in fact because they live to such a great age. And there's reasons why they live to such a great age, and it's because they've kind of they've evolved to live a long life. And there's certain factors about them that we've noticed now that are sort of design features for that longevity. Now, often this will mean that the tree is completely hollow. Now, in conventional arboriculture for decades, hollow and decay has been taught to arborists like me as kind of a bad thing. And if you think about it, arborists like me for many years earned our living by looking at trees with hollow parts like this and saying, oh, I don't know what's holding that tree up. It's very likely to fall down. You better cut it down, missus. And what we've learned from this is ancient trees very often are all hollow. And in fact, this tree, which might be 700 or 800 years old as well, and there's others in Great Windsor Park that are 1100 years old, they have this hollow trunk. And I think what's interesting about the hollow trunk is if you think about it as like a structure, other structures that are round and circular and hollow, things like towers, chimneys, and turbines, have a degree of flex in them and a flexibility. So with ancient trees, they have this flexible trunk, but they also have a small crown. And it's likely that these trees survive hurricanes, 1987 hurricane and other strong winds and storms because of this small crown and this flexing in the trunk that you don't get with rigid trees. And what I mean by rigid trees is trees that have heartwood, because it's the heartwood that has decayed in the center of the tree, and the trees don't need the heartwood. They don't need it to survive. And so that's a really important point to remember as we go through this. They've also got other design features that allows them to have long lives. And one of this is something that we have noticed, and we call this the Eiffel Tower effect. There's a fungi that has hollowed out the base of this tree. Admittedly, some of this is also from soil erosion, but initially the center of this tree has been hollowed out by a fungi. But what it's left is the healthy buttress roots here. And it's left it in a structure very much like the Eiffel Tower. And if you think about the Eiffel Tower, it's not that dissimilar to this. So it's a strong structure, but it's got a normal tree on the top of it. And it's one of these trees that we don't need to do absolutely anything to it. That tree is really, really strong in that, but because it doesn't have roots in the conventional sense, and because it's hollow up here, it doesn't mean that's a bad thing. In fact, it's designed to do this. It's designed to do it, and this is how they live such a long time. Other features that we've noticed are how trees also propagate themselves in the long term and designed for longevity are an example like this, where this is a silver birch tree, and it's at a place called Staverton Park in Suffolk, which is really famous for ancient trees, but not necessarily birch trees, more ancient oak pollards. What's happened here is this tree was tall and upright at one point, and it's actually fallen over. And as it's fallen over, the branches have touched the ground, and you can see here other branches that are coming up that have actually formed into new trees. And this is what we call layering. I call this tree Nessie, and it reminds me of how it kind of like the Loch Ness monster with these branches going up and down like this. But what's really special about this is eventually this will all decay and gradually disappear, and you'll be left with these trees. And there's nothing to say that if they're left alone, that they might do the same thing again and fall over and root again. So it's really interesting that trees can move, and trees can move, this is at least 10 meters between here and here. But what's also is important about this is generally when trees fall over, people clear them up. And what I'm trying to say tonight, and the point I'm trying to go is, you don't necessarily need to do that for reasons of tidiness, because what we're trying to do is preserve the biodiversity that lives in these trees, because because of their great age and because of all these features that they have in pockets, little hollows, little cracks, little splits. There's all sorts of things that like to live in them that become niche and rare. This is another example of how trees can design for longevity, and it's the same but different with the tree I just showed you previously. This is an oak tree, and it's actually wider than it is tall, and it's unusual because it's what we call an open grown tree. And most trees that you see like this only become open grown like this if they're in a park or a large open space, or things like that. Very often, what we've noticed about this is that most trees actually have their lower branches cut off. So this tree is unusual because we can see its branches touching down to the earth, and again they've rooted. And again, these branches here can actually form new trees and continue to grow again. So this tree potentially could live forever if it roots and goes again and goes again. Also, interestingly, you'll notice that these branches, they almost become like props. They prop the old tree until it gets to the point where that gradually decays. So these are all things that we don't really see because through forestry practices, silvicultural practices, horticultural practices, and things like trees that are in parks, we always cut these branches off to allow people to walk through them, drive beneath them, move beneath them, sit underneath them, or allow animals to graze on them. So this is unusual, but this is how trees are actually designed to do. And the point I'm trying to make about this is if you see a branch that's bending, and sometimes they get little cracks in them here, which are called hazard beams, and I jokingly refer to them as not a hazard beam because they're not a hazard. All they do is they split there, and it allows the branch then to touch the ground, which is what they're designed to do. Another really important thing that we've learned from working at Hatfield Forest is that trees actually can retrench and the crowns can reform again. And what's happened here to this tree, this is at the Knepp Castle estate, which is the very, very famous site, which is known for being the first estate in the UK to rewild. And this tree is referred to by a friend of mine, Ted Green, as the rainforest oak, because it's got 4 different red data book species of fungi living in it and around it. But what's happened here is that the tree has actually died back at one point, and what we call retrenchment. And if you imagine this with a big fluffy crown above those branches at one point, and they've gradually died back, what you can see before that happens often is what we call a secondary crown. And these branches, these were the secondary crown. And what's happened is this has died back. The crown is growing again, and it's actually overtaking the retrenched branches. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that crowns can grow back once again, even if they look like they're dying. And very often we jump to conclusions that trees are in a poor condition if we see dead branches. But in actual fact, with old trees, what it's demonstrating is that it's just a life phase that the tree's in. It doesn't mean that it's dying. In fact, it means it's retrenching. And very often, if the vitality of the tree is good, it can go again. But we don't see this because very often people cut these branches out. So it's hard to read. But once you get your eye in, I'm sure you'll start seeing secondary lower canopies in trees. And you can start to see where they can overtake trees that are dying back where the deadwood is left. I've been talking about deadwood, and deadwood is super important. Here you can see this is a standing dead oak in Sherwood Forest where we work. And all forms of deadwood are really, really important for biodiversity. I'm talking about standing deadwood, falling deadwood, like you see in the background here, dead branches in the crown of the tree, and branches that fall in rivers, ponds, lakes, etc. Now, the reason why deadwood is really important is that over 2,000 different types of invertebrates rely on deadwood as part of its life cycle, and 7% of all species somehow use deadwood in their life cycle. Now, saproxylic species, which is what that means is species that live on deadwood, are some of the most threatened in Europe. And in 2012, there was a survey done which said that 11% of these species were threatened. And then another survey done in 2018 said that 18% of them are threatened. So it's a deteriorating situation, and it's really, really important that we help these species that rely on this by not removing it wherever possible. So I'm guessing you're already thinking that I'm a bit of a bugs and berries guy and that I don't live in the real world. I'm just interested in dead trees and old trees, and that's a real problem because what about when they're in towns and not in beautiful Sherwood Forest, and how do you look after them when they're on your patch and you're responsible for them because bits drop off them? Well, I thought I would just give you a few statistics just to try and get things into proportion, because I believe that an awful lot of tree work is done in a disproportionate way to the risk. And these are a few statistics to help you understand that. So you've got a 1 in 10 million chance of being killed by a tree or a part of a tree. That's kind of on your own land and things like that. Or a 1 in 20 million chance of being killed by a tree in a public open space. That's you tree owners who own trees. So that's compared to a 1 in 18 million chance of being hit by lightning. Most of us all drive, and if you drive a car, you've got a 1 in 16,000 chance of being killed in a road accident. Other interesting stats to try and put this stuff into proportion is 55 people a year suffer from non-fatal tree-related injuries, but 2,200 people are injured annually by wheelie bins. So what I'm trying to say is you're at a lot more risk from your wheelie bin than your tree in your garden. If you don't believe me, there's some. I've got these statistics from something called the National Tree Safety Group, and they've written a book in 2012 called Common Sense Risk Management of Trees, and I urge you to get a copy of it because it really helps put things into proportion, and it really might help you think about the proportionality of any work that you might be thinking to have done to trees. So a big part of all of this is fungi. And as I said earlier, taught colleges, ARB colleges for decades, we've been taught that fungi equals bad. And if you think about it, including myself in the past, I looked at fungi on trees and thought, right, that's a hole, that's a problem, that equals money. And so many of us arborists have earned our living in the past by picking out what were deemed as faults on trees because of the fungi. And it generates work for us. But people are becoming much better educated now, and in actual fact, fungi are really important because they're symbiotic with trees, and often they're latent in the trees, and they have in fact, trees cannot survive without fungi, right from the roots right to the upper crown. I mentioned earlier the Eiffel Tower effect, and this is the fungi. It's Pseudonotus Dryadius, and this is the one that causes the Eiffel Tower effect. And if you look at it, where the fruiting brackets of the tree is that go up here, it goes in between what we call in the tree world the toes of the tree, or the buttress roots. Now, if these buttress roots are healthy, all that the fungi is doing is recycling the heartwood in the tree, and it's recycling the nutrients in the heartwood tree, which it also feeds the tree. It's a completely natural life phase and cycle that trees go through. So if you see this on a tree, you don't need to panic. You don't need to, and nothing needed to be done to this tree, and it still stands to this day. Obviously, if there were a problem with these buttress roots, then maybe you might think again. But I'm just trying to show you that it's really important to get good advice about your trees, and good advice about and good ID skills from things like fungi, because it'll help you to make better informed decisions. And we need to start thinking about all of this hollowing as an important feature rather than a fault, because of all the biodiversity it supports. But also up in the crown of the tree, hollowing is really important for other types of biodiversity. You can see this hollow here. I've got a friend who has a camera trap on a tree just like this. And she said that one morning that she's noticed 6 different species just using this hole. And how this hole is formed was originally because it started to hollow probably through some type of fungi. And what happens is the woodpeckers become interested in the tree because they sense that there are insects that become attracted to the hollowing and the softer or decaying wood. And they take advantage of that, and they chip out a hole, and then that hole eventually becomes a bigger hole, and that hole eventually becomes a nesting site. And then after that, it's very often that the woodpeckers don't use that hole forever, and the other species of bird use it. But also, you'll notice here around this hole compared to this hole is it's been gnawed around the side, and what that is squirrels. Squirrels gnaw the sides of these holes to keep them open, because they're interested in getting into the holes, because they're interested in the eggs, and they're also interested in the long term, and they then use the holes themselves for nests and drays as well. So super important for wildlife. And also this wood that you see around here is a bit like when you break a bone. The wound that's around the bone, as it heals, is much stronger. So just because there's a hole in the tree doesn't mean the tree is going to fail there. This tree here is what foresters would call a snag, and it's about less than 20 feet tall. It's something, if I'm honest, years ago I would have felled because it looks a bit scruffy, it's a bit untidy, and you'd think, well, it's a dead tree, it's probably going to fall over. let's have it over and let's make some space for the healthy trees. But it really doesn't need to be felled. Because the top has come off it, it's likely to stand for a long, long time. I'm talking years, possibly decades. But you can see on the trunk that there's some little brackets, and the brackets on the trunk are Fomes fomenteris, which is known as the hoof fungus or tinder hoof fungus. And why that's interesting is it's caused hollowing in the trunk, and you'll see little cavities appearing on it. And in those cavities is a lesser spotted woodpecker's nest. And if you're a birder, you'll know that's a super rare bird. And this is the sort of thing that arborists like me were knocking over day in, day out, and through ignorance. They really don't need to be felled. We really should be retaining them as much as possible. Something else that the fungi do, and I was saying that fungi is like the ultimate recycler. Here, this is a tree at Sherwood Forest, and what we've got here developing is what we call aerial tree soil. And this, what happens here is as the fungi decays the heartwood of the tree, which the tree then uses as a recycler and recycles the nutrients, it forms this tree soil. And this tree soil can take literally hundreds of years to develop. So it's super rare, it's super niche, and we get all sorts of very, very rare and interesting creatures living in it, particularly Sherwood, the darkling beetle. Now, it's nearly impossible to recreate that because we haven't got 200-300 years to do it again. So what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, if you see this in a tree and you think it looks like the tree's in poor condition, this has stood again for decades. This deadwood can hang on to a tree for absolutely decades. And so it's really important to try and preserve this wherever possible. Interestingly here, this is another hornbeam pollard at Hatfield Forest where we work. The front of the tree is dropped off. And here's the tree soil, this darkness down the trunk here. And the tree has sent roots down. This is another long-term survival strategy of trees that has sent roots down through the tree soil, right down to and right down to the ground. So if this tree was gradually to collapse and this tree, the part was to fall on the ground, it's very likely to layer, as we saw earlier, because it's also supported by a root that's attached to the ground. So just incredible what trees can do if you let them and you observe them. I do understand that again that we see trees with dead branches and what people used to call faults in trees near public places and perhaps over roads and things like that. And I understand that, you know, from time to time these branches do drop off. So first of all, it's really important to get good advice and to find out whether how strongly or weakly attached these branches are. And there's ways of doing it which are very cheap and easy to do, which means that you can just pull a branch like this. If you can throw a rope over it, you can test it with the weight of someone on the ground, doing it carefully, obviously, and with a helmet on. So if it were to break, it wasn't going to hurt you. But from time to time, we realize that branches like this do have to be either removed or shortened. But there are things that you can do rather than completely removing them, and which allows you to keep some of the biodiversity and also these things for the saproxylic species to live on. What we do is we shorten it, and you can see here what we've done is we've cut that. That was Stuart, who was in the photograph before. He was cutting this into what we call a natural fracture cut. And so these natural fracture cuts look, you know, to the untrained eye, you can hardly tell that's been done by a chainsaw. This is great. This jagged edge is great because aesthetically it looks more pleasing. It looks more natural, but combined with that, a larger surface area here is also great for biodiversity versus a flat straight cut. So something else that we do in situations like this, perhaps if these branches were over a road and we've done a pull test and we know that they need to come off, is you could remove the dead branches over the road only, but leave the branches out the back of the tree. Perhaps if there was a field or a verge or something like that, just cut the branches over the road. Don't cut the branches all over the tree and leave all that strongly attached deadwood. I can tell you that Ted Green, who lives around Windsor Great Park and has lived there, is in his late 80s and has lived there since he was a kid, knows dead trees and dead branches and trees that have been there since he was a boy. So just because it's dead and it's died doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fall over. Here's a little quick case study for you. It's from Sherwood Forest. This branch here, you can see I sneakily took a photograph of this this little girl and her dad. He'd put her on the branch, and people were regularly bouncing on this branch like a swing. And the RSPB were concerned that because this branch had died, that it eventually, with the weight of someone bouncing up and down on it regularly, it would snap, and then there would be an issue. So what we did is we shortened it, but we've shortened it, but kept on the fungi there, because this fungi is really important. This is, again, is Fomes fomentarius, which is the same fungi that we saw on the silver birch tree with the lesser spotted woodpecker nesting. But for the first time, we've seen it on oak at Sherwood Forest, and that's a first. And if you look in reference books, Fomes fomentarius does not grow on oak trees in the UK. The only place they say it does grow is on trees, oak trees in the Mediterranean. So this really is the signs of climate change, you know, before our very eyes. And here's what we did. There's one of these fracture cuts that we put into the tree. We've retained the fungi. Sadly, the branch had to be removed, but we left it in situ, and we left it lying in the woodland there for it to decay and rot away and support other species that likes decaying wood on the floor. Very quickly, and not for ancient trees, and these are perhaps some of the tips that I thought I could give you with regards to younger trees. Now, we have this incredible population. We've got, I think I said earlier, that we've got more ancient trees in Britain than the rest of Europe put together. It's a very, very common sight to see ancient trees in the UK, but not in other places in Europe. But what we've recognised is there's a population of ancient trees in the UK that there's quite an age gap between those and the current generation, sometimes of several hundred years. Now, we've been talking about all the biodiversity and things that live in ancient trees. And what we worry about is gradually, as those trees gradually die over time, what will happen to all those niche and rare species, all the saproxylics and things like that that use hollowing and deadwood and things like that, that they find on these ancient trees. So first of all, don't fell all the what we not politely call knackered trees. It's really good if you can keep a few trees with cavities and faults, you know, what we used to call faults in trees. Try to preserve those trees, because they are the ancients of the future. It's those trees with all those cavities that will be the ancients of the future. So wherever possible, try and preserve those. But where you can't do that, we've been doing something which we call veteranization. Now, veteranization is for young trees that you'd ordinarily fell. And an example of this is perhaps if you're a forester and you have, say, 1,000 trees in a forest, and you need to fell 300 to thin the trees to allow the remaining crop to grow more. So instead of felling 1,000 trees, instead of felling 300 trees, you fell 298 and you leave two trees. And it's those trees that we've been experimenting with. We've been cutting in features into them to try to mimic what we see in old trees. And this is what we call veteranization. It's been around since the 1970s, but I've been very fortunate to be involved with it at Hatfield Forest now for nearly 20 years. And also I was involved in something called the International Veteranization Project, which started in 2012, which was between three countries, Sweden, Norway, and the UK. And we did all the work in the UK for the project involving 4 sites. And what we've now found is that it's a 25-year study. The results for the first part of the study has come back that cutting in features into live trees, younger trees, does work, and they are finding that species associated normally with older trees are using some of these features. So quickly, this here is what we've created a hollowing behind here. We cut 2 slots into the tree here and 2 slots either side there, and then it came in through the side and cut a slot, and then slid the piece of wood out. We drilled a woodpecker hole in the front, and then we cut the back of the piece of wood back and slid it back into the hole, and then we attached it with 2 tiny little nails here. But in a year, the tree has grown and occluded around that, and it's now holding that piece of wood in there, and there's a cavity behind it. It's kind of a brilliant bit of hollowing. Here's another one that we did in 2012 for the International Veteranization Project, and you can see where the woodpecker hole has been chiseled out by something else, another perhaps a woodpecker, I don't know. But you can also see that the front has we've got a little bit of decay here. We've got flaking bark. We've got wound wood, which we call ram's horning as it's growing around. And this interface here is just brilliant for bats, and this hole is also brilliant for lots of other roosting and nesting species. We've also experimented with open cavities, and this again is at Sherwood. And again, this was only done a year ago, and we've already got amazingly at the bottom of this tree soil forming, which I really found hard to believe after only a few months. This is the first one that we did in the crown of a tree, an aerial open hollow. But up the top here, we cut some slots in that we were for bats to crawl up into. And this is another technique that we've done, and it's what we call a lightning strike. And this guy here, Andy Clark, who's my sidekick, it was his idea to try and recreate a lightning strike down a tree. And you can see on another one here, he's cut into the heartwood. Cutting into the heartwood promotes hollowing, but you can see here, because the tree is young, it's still got lots of vitality. It's trying to occlude around or heal around this wound, and it's this interface that's brilliant for all sorts of different species, as I said before. And here's another one that we've done where we've hollowed out the end of a branch and again cut slots up into it for things that like living on that. So this is an ancient oak tree at Sherwood Forest. It's about 700 years old. And as I said, we've carried out some veteranization techniques to this tree here, because as part of the program, what we've been doing is what we call halo thinning around the ancient trees. And oak, like this, has a high light demand, and you can see there are very few branches around the bottom, and that's because it's been shaded by these other trees around it. Now, in this situation, ancient oak trumps young oak. So what we've done is we were charged with removing some of the trees around the ancient oak to allow it more light, so the lower branches didn't die. So instead of felling the tree, we've cut them as what we call a habitat pole or monolith. And you can see where we cut it off here. We've left the deadwood on, but also just as an experiment, we've attached another tree that we found fallen over a footpath somewhere else, and it's got a hollow in it, and we've cut that off and we've strapped it to the tree. And what we're hoping is that hollow will collect water. Aerial water pockets are great for certain flies and wasps and things like that. You can see another one here to the right, where a fallen dead tree we've strapped up to another tree with ratchet straps, and it looks like it was a big job, but in fact it didn't take very long at all. And these ratchet straps are very strong and secure and tested to a certain weight, so we know it's not going to fall over. This is kind of really easy, practical techniques that you can do. Even just leaving things as poles rather than felling them are great, as they either die or they sometimes even regrow, but they're really great for wildlife. So that's kind of it. And I just wanted to finish by saying, it'd be great if you manage tree populations to think about the advice that you get. If you can, try and use an Arboricultural Association registered consultant, or an if I can say it, Arboricultural Association approved contractor, tree contractors. You're more likely to meet one of those who will be much more sympathetic to the wildlife in the trees. So from a tree like this, which is 1100 years old, I just thought I'd finish with a little bit of wisdom from a Chinese proverb, which I thought was very apt. So the twisted tree lives out its life. The straight tree ends up as a board. Thanks very much.
That was fantastic. We have our chairman back. Charles, can you unmute yourself? You're still muted, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm now muted.
Ah, there we go.
Got it. I have to say I must apologise for having missed the first 5 minutes. I'm having some considerable difficulty. I'm now on a foreign computer, so I don't know how it works. I apologise. I think I'm just in awe. I can't really say very much. I'm in total awe. And we'll pass on to our second speaker, who is the well-known local conservationist and farmer, Robert Crocker. Over to you, Robert.
Good evening. Am I live? Can you hear me?
Yeah, indeed we can.
Thank goodness for that. I'd like you just to imagine the possibility of a conservation scheme that stretches for 25,000 miles, a national nature network linking all existing habitats and existing schemes, with new ones added, stretching out like veins of a leaf, connecting woodland to wetland, diverse hay meadows to the sanctuary of motorway verges, riverbanks to inner city parks and allotments. Imagine the biggest leap forward in conservation since the systematic deconstruction of our countryside began out of the need to feed ourselves during the Second World War. Well, you may be surprised to hear that that network actually exists. It's just that we've forgotten it's there. It's hiding in plain sight. We already have a national network of hedges for wildlife and for people. We simply need to acknowledge these wonderful assets, respect and manage them as the precious resources that they are. Now, I farm approximately 600 acres, and I also run a landscape gardening business. And today I had the pleasure of driving from 3 of our projects, one near North Leach, the other in Kingham, and the other in Leafield. So a very, very picturesque round trip to see how everything was going. And as I toured the Cotswolds, 2 things struck me. One was that almost all the hedges had been cut this winter. Now, hedges blossom mostly on last year's growth. So when they're trimmed, you get very little blossom, pollen, nectar, and very few berries. Now, the whole place looked fantastic, very well managed. Well, actually, overmanaged, desperately overmanaged. Not just the hedges, but the verges. And somehow we have to change our attitude to how we look after everything. Yes, obviously, roadside hedges need to be trimmed for sight lines, for safety, etc., etc. But there is absolutely no reason why all of these hedges have to be trimmed annually. It basically denudes the potential. I've played around on our own farm for the last 20 or 25 years with wildlife corridors. And initially I had about 300 acres to play with. And I would sort of just look and see how things worked the year before and try and link different features together. We've got a stream which runs on the northern boundary, so that makes a fantastic corridor, and it doesn't matter if it gets very big because it's not really blocking out an awful lot of light. Now, in 2013, about 25 of the wildlife nature NGOs got together and produced the first State of Nature report, and then again in 2016. And the reoccurring theme was that loss of habitat and fragmentation of habitat was adding to species decline. It just sounds so simple. And I actually went to the State of Nature presentation at Blenheim Palace in 2016, I think it was. And I just wanted to shout, then create more habitat and just join it up. So over the last 10 years, I have been writing articles and giving talks and trying to persuade anyone that will listen that somehow we just need to pool all our resources and link everything together. And I was delighted to hear that Monty Don was courting controversy last week by suggesting that this obsession with neatness was mostly a male trait. Now, most farms are run by blokes, and I deal with all the head gardeners on some pretty big gardens, and they just love snipping and pruning and mowing and spraying and fertilizing, which is fine to a point, but we've just overdone it. So I have been trying to persuade my fellow farmers not to leave all their hedges to look untidy. This is the problem. It's a mental attitude. But to maybe just look at 10%, only 10%. And in this country, we have 250,000 miles of hedgerows, managed hedgerows, over-managed hedgerows. And if we just left 10% as designated wildlife corridors, I've written it down, the National Hedgerow Network of designated, sympathetically managed, seamlessly interconnected wildlife corridors linking habitats across the country, a linear nature reserve comprising of 10% of the existing hedgerows, a potential of 25,000 miles, linking each national park, one to another. Connectivity of habitat is paramount for species survival. How have I got on? Well, up to date, not very well, quite frankly. I think I've spoken to everyone that'll listen. I went to the Country File event at Blenheim 2 summers ago with the express mission of talking to the Country File team. And I went along with all my bullet points and brochures and just handed it over and said, look, please, somebody just give it to the right person, because I'm just making no progress here. And I didn't hear a single thing until suddenly Chris Packham turned up on television on the Winter Watch about a month and a half ago. And it was wonderful. He just read one of my brochures out without even altering the punctuation. So thank you very much, Chris. I'm sure you're watching tonight. I do appreciate that. I was looking on Google Earth for something unrelated when I suddenly spotted that my farm had been outlined in white. And I was quite horrified. I thought maybe it was the RPA after me. So, but when I put my glasses on, I realized that actually the photographs had been taken in May, and the white lines were the May blossom, the hawthorn in flower. And I then looked further, and as you go towards Blenheim, it just petered out, little dots here and there, but very, very few hedgerows to reach their potential. I think the thing that really changed my thinking on all of this was when we took on the tenancy of City Farm, which had and still has the most wonderful hedgerows. It's very difficult as a tenant farmer to do exactly what you'd like to do. You are constrained by the terms of your tenancy agreement. So my farm was still actually quite neat and tidy. This one was fabulous. There were hedges which were 20, 30 feet tall and as wide, with massive rose briars growing up through the middle, cascading down, brambles laden with blossom and laden with fruit. And the amount of fruit actually on the hedges in the autumn was, well, still is. I mean, it's just a sight to behold. There is another picture there somewhere, Lucy. Yes, that's just basically suggesting that when we cut our hedges for that year, or maybe the following year, we have denuded its potential to produce fruit, pollen, nectar, etc. Now, that is quite a young hedge, and that's how much fruit a hedge can produce if it's left to grow for about 5 years. Now, one of the reasons that hedges are not left to grow this big is probably purely economic. To cut and lay a hedge, which was the traditional way of managing them, every 7 to 10 years, at today's price, it costs £16.50 per metre to cut and lay and top bind a hedge. If you compare that with just a few pence per metre with annual flail cutting. So you can understand why, from an economic point of view, these hedges are cut annually. The other reason, I guess, that hedges are still over managed is, I think, a missense place of pride. I was a graduate of the mid-1970s, and everything that I was taught at agricultural college has turned out to be not exactly right, and an awful lot of it was absolutely wrong. Nearly all the pesticides and the chemicals that we used to use have now been banned because they were poisons. Part of my agricultural course was to amass a plant collection to actually press the flowers, the plants, in the traditional way, to label them with their Latin name, then their common name, and then the all-important piece of information was to say how you would control or kill them. So that really does show where we've come from and where we are now. Now, modern farming is so much better and so different to how it was in the 1970s and 80s, which was almost the perfect storm of everything that could be wrong. But nevertheless, modern farming is just so total and so fast that nature has no opportunity to adapt. So somehow we have to find a space for nature to coexist. I'm aware that I'm possibly talking to parish councillors or villagers who are looking at their own situation and thinking, what can we do? You know, we have no control of this land. We don't have vast amounts of land. Well, there are quite a few things you can do. And I would encourage you to look at connecting habitats by whatever means possible. Persuade gardeners to somehow link their gardens. It's been done with hedgehog runs, but just to have areas of blossom, and also not to be too neat. The dying leaves from one year harbor so many insects, so don't tidy everything up. I was absolutely delighted to hear Reg's talk and see how the progression, very similar to my own, from the original thinking of what you were taught when you started off maybe a decade or two or three ago, has now changed, but not everyone has come to this conclusion. Out of frustration, I decided to write a protest song. It started as a poem, but it turned out into a song. The title could have been District Councils, please educate your contractors not to cut everything down at the wrong time of year, but it didn't scan very well and it was difficult to sing. But the one that I did come up with is for my fellow farmers, and it's called Farmers Spare the Hedge. And if you'll forgive me, because we are in a climate emergency, and anything that helps, I will attempt to sing it for you. So here we go. Farmers spare the hedge. Farmers spare the hedge. Don't cut off all the berries, crabs and sloes and hips and haws, of which there should be many. In summer food is plentiful, but winter time is harder. Wildlife needs the fruit and nuts, the hedgerows nature's larder. Farmers spare the hedge this year, please heed the words we utter. Wildlife needs a place to live, so silence your hedge cutter. Next spring when the cuckoo sings, the sap will rise and life begins. There'll be no home for living things if you don't spare the hedge. Farmers spare the hedge. It's really your decision. Farmers, spare the hedge, make nature your religion. Nature likes it wild and free. The experts now will all agree that farmers all have OCD. That's obsessive cutting disorder. So who will spare the bee? The farmer spared the hedge, made stewardship his oath. Pollen nectar for the bees, blossom born on last year's growth. A yellowhammer needs a bramble patch, a woodpecker's hole for a pipistrelle bat, an ivy-covered tree for a nuthatch to fledge. And all because the farmer spared this hedge. I do apologize.
I thought there ought to be a little bit of a gap at that moment, Robert. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and I have been looking for some time for a wonderful excuse to cease the destructive gardening, which my wife sends me out with chainsaws for a long, long time. I now have a good reason and answer to her pleas. Yes. Let me move forward to our third speaker this evening, Kate Perry, who I see now on the screen. Kate is here to speak of her top tips for Plant Life's Road Verge campaign. Kate.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I'm not quite sure how to follow that, but now I know who to go to if we need a song about verges and managing them properly, don't I? So there we go. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me along to talk to you all this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Kate, I'm the Road Verge campaign manager at Plant Life. I joined Plant Life 2.5 years ago to manage the campaign. Plant Life, for those of you who don't know, we're a charity dedicated to conserving the UK's wild plants and fungi. And as part of my role, I work a lot with councils, highways agencies, with contractors and local groups and individuals of all different types to provide guidance and advice and to encourage more wildlife friendly management of verges across the UK. So Plant Life's campaign, the Road Verge campaign, started back in 2013, really in response to the growing number of inquiries and desperate phone calls we'd get from our members and members of the public at verges being mown down in full flower, and the disparity really of what verges more and more were becoming versus what they could be, and really starting to lose the colour of summer from our verges. And a lot of the work that the campaign has been doing is to raise awareness of the importance of these wonderful habitats and to start to change the perceptions of what verges are and what they can be. They're much more than just spaces that flash by in your car wing mirror. And there are two things really that are central to the campaign. We have our petition to councils, which people can sign to ask their councils to start to implement more wildlife friendly management, and also that the guidance and advice that we provide to anybody on what good management looks like and what people can start to do. And this sort of all begs the question of, why do we care so much about verges? Why do they matter so much? And road verges really are as diverse as all the landscapes that they pass through in the UK. Over 700 species of wildflowers can be found on our verges, and that's nearly 45% of the total flora that can be found in the UK. So verges therefore support so much a wealth of plant life, and as we like to say at Plant Life, where wildflowers lead, wildlife follows. So a huge wealth of other biodiversity, or bugs, bees, bats, birds and butterflies all rely on these wonderful habitats and the habitats adjacent to them. And often, you know, the focus is on biodiversity and the innate value of plants and wildlife, perhaps arguably rightly so. I won't get into that now, but often there's a case of recognizing that there are other benefits, and often this can be talked of in terms of ecosystem services. So a well-managed verge can sequester carbon, it can lock in carbon to the verge. They can act as buffers for noise and air pollution, as well as helping to increase well-being too. We know that for some people, verges really are their only connection with nature on the daily commute or walk. And it's increasingly, you know, recognised how important that connection to nature is, and lots of people have really enjoyed noticing what's on their verges, on their doorsteps during lockdown, when we've all been forced to slow down a bit more and see what actually comes into bloom when the mowers can't get out there as well. And road verges really are, as Robert has said with hedges, you know, there's this ready-made network, these ribbons across the country, and they have a huge potential. So to only think of them as something as adjacent to the road is really a missed opportunity. There's a wealth of mini meadows on verges just waiting to be created if management can be changed. And really, this is because we've created a pretty tough situation on verges out there over many decades through increased mowing or neglect and change of management practice, through increased nitrogen emissions, problems with litter, and with budget cuts too. There's been this perfect storm really. So Plant Life set out a new vision for verges, really one where they're managed with nature in mind whilst keeping roads safe too. And these are two examples. That's the guidance that we've produced at Plant Life, and both of these guides are available on our website to download. And they really set out practical advice in order to implement this vision, and a different approach to management, one which will transform the verge network, not just in isolated pockets of verges, to improve biodiversity, but also in the long term to make verge management more sustainable and cost efficient too. So I'm going to give you a whistle stop tour through some of our key management principles and some of our top tips that we've gathered from working with councils and communities across the country. So the first sort of key principle of making a good grassland verge or a nice bit of grassland, often I think there's the apprehension maybe that wildlife friendly verges means no cutting, just leaving everything to go. And really, studies of meadow management have shown that no cutting and also cutting too much can both cause problems for species rich grassland. Without some sort of regular management, thick grasses can quickly dominate. The sort of thug plants of the verge can take over. And this is a problem because it crowds out some of the most delicate wildflowers on the verge. So in order to maximize the potential of your verges, some sort of annual or cyclical management is really important to keep your grassland healthy, to keep some of the competitive species in check, and also to keep your management regimes cost effective and to maximize all those wonderful benefits of your verges as well. The second key thing is around timing, and this might seem very obvious, but it's really important to let the wildflowers grow, flower and set seed before we mow them down. And that way we're working with nature, and nature's actually doing a lot of the work for us. The seeds start to replenish the seed bank in the soil, and you get this natural regeneration over time as well. So by cutting too early or too frequently or too late, you can quickly get rid of many of the species and actually reduce the floral diversity and the quality of your verges. So the ideal option, and there are different ways of doing this timing, but the ideal option is a two-cut management approach, and this sort of really mimics your traditional meadow management. There are different timings of this, different ways you can do it, and if you can only do one cut, then you can cut sort of after the end of the flowering season in August, September time, and where possible, collect the arisings, collect the grass cuttings as well. And I know this takes me nicely on into the next point, and something that I know is a bit of a headache for people out there managing verges, especially what to do with the grass cuttings that, you know, that are the arisings. And collecting the grass cuttings is so important, really, because low soil fertility is the key to sort of enhancing, improving the wildlife value, and to reduce the management burden that you have in keeping up with these verges. And that's really because wildflowers really do best in low fertility soils. So by collecting the grass cuttings, you start to take away some of the nutrients in the verges themselves, and you also remove the thatch of dried grass that builds up. So you open up the grassland sward, allowing the more delicate wildflowers to thrive and to come through. And when you repeat this year on year, because there's reduced nutrients in the verge, then you get less grass growth over time. So then you reduce the needs to cut so often. There are lots of different ways to do this, and I'm going to cover a few of those today, which I hope will help and aid the practical nature of this as well. And also because I think many people will be, you know, sort of feeling, okay, well, that's all well and good, but how on earth do we go and do this? It is a challenge, but it's not impossible. And there has been some wonderful examples of more and more councils that are finding ways to bring the collection of arisings into their management regimes. Often the equipment to do this costs money, and often costs more money than the equipment that's generally used to manage the verges. But several councils are looking at this in terms of investor save budgets, or because of the benefits that managing verges in a more sustainable way can bring in terms of reducing carbon, or actually, you know, creating better habitats for verges. There's sort of lots of, even if you think about it as a tick box exercise, there are lots of things that make a lot of sense for investing in now to create a more sustainable and efficient management process. So there's a really nice example of this down from Dorset, who put together a business case for buying this equipment, because over time it would reduce the time and the money that they would spend on grass cutting. And it's really worked for them. And perhaps this works best in urban areas. So for example, in Dorset, they used to cut 12 times a year, I think, in urban locations. And now they only have to cut 2 or 3 times a year because of this cycle of cut and collect, which has created really wonderful flower-rich, short-growing verges in urban environments that have gone down really well with residents and members of the public too. Often, if you can't get rid of the grass cuttings from the verge completely, that's okay. You can rake up or collect the grass cuttings into small heaps, small piles in the verge that can act as nice habitat sites. These can be put towards the back of the verge or in nearby sites. So that can work quite well, and it's useful because you've taken most of the thick thatch or the nutrients away from the majority of the verge. So that works quite well. And it can be a big investment to invest in this different types of equipment. So it's important to know the right thing to buy and know that it's going to work on your verges and work for you. There's been some nice examples of this. So up in Denbighshire in North Wales, the council actually borrowed some equipment from the local AONB and used it as a trial on their verges, which has worked really well, and they're adopting that further. And often it's a case that it doesn't have to be large scale or mechanical equipment that does this. A nice bit of elbow grease and a rake, and lots of enthusiastic people to get involved with it where it's safe to do so. Volunteers and communities getting involved with this, raking up the cuttings and taking them away, that can work equally as well. So just a few, just to talk through a few options on different equipment that you can have. So the first one, the sort of handheld tools, which is actually the bottom picture on this slide. These are really versatile and efficient bits of kit. They often come with lots of different attachments for the different things that you might want to do, like a brush cutting head or a mini baler. This is the sort of kit that Denbighshire Council and the AUMB have been using. And they work quite well on sloping verges, or where access is a bit of a problem as well. Then going on to the sort of tractor mounted suction flail of country file fame, the big piece of kit from Lincolnshire that you might have seen hoovering up the verges, thanks to Matt Baker driving it, and all the links to the anaerobic digestion plant they have there. This is a big piece of bespoke kit that was put together as part of a project by the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust and Peak Hill Associates around a business case to take the arisings to anaerobic digesters. It's a specialist bit of kit, and rather on the pricey side. Kit like this is used really widely in the Netherlands on big, flat, wide verges. There's now a project ongoing down in Kent by the Wildlife Trust, trying to develop this going forwards. And I'm more than happy to sort of share links with that at the moment. But we're probably quite a way off seeing that sort of machinery widespread around the country at the moment. Another option is a sort of large scale flail collector, perhaps like a Rytec flail and collector and hopper that you might use for traditional meadow management. They can be really good for large areas or wide verges, and can cope with some of the thicker sort of plants. But if you don't really have those large flat verges, perhaps that's more useful for meadow type areas. And then finally, the Ryden Mowers, like they use down in Dorset. These are really useful to hoover up all those grass cuttings again when you're cutting at the same time. They leave a really nice, neat finish. And the picture there is mostly sort of what it used to be like in Dorset. I don't have a sort of after picture on the same slide, but now it's very sort of short growing, rich in daisies, trefoils and clovers, that has been created by the sort of continual removal of arisings. And it's sort of important to say here that often I think in the first year or the first 2 or 3 years in this case, they cut 3-4 times a year. Didn't really matter when, just to sort of kickstart that regeneration of the grassland and the verge, to get rid of as much of the nutrients as possible. And then you really start to see the wildflowers bounce back, and you can cut in sort of late summer and again before Christmas to really keep that going. And yes, just to highlight here that there's a great video that was put together by Welsh councils last year for the Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference. There was a whole afternoon session on wildlife friendly road verge management. This is a really nice 20-minute video that looks at all the different types of machineries that Welsh councils are currently using to manage their road verges and wildflower meadows and grassland in their care as well. So I'll also share the link for this afterwards, or have a Google for the Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference. And if you go to day 4, the Thursday session on this, there's a whole load of really nice videos, including this one on YouTube, and a nice bit of chat of the pros and cons, what has worked well with them, and how they're learning from each other there as well. So then to finish off with a few more tips from us, the first of these we like to call the biodiversity buzz cut. We often think of that verges have to be long to be wildlife friendly, don't they? Surely, but low growing verges can be rich in short growing wildflower species. So your bird's-foot trefoil, self-heals, daisies, clovers, and these are absolutely brilliant for pollinators. And this buzz cut approach can be really useful when there are concerns about longer grass, those concerns about neatness and messiness that Robert's mentioned as well. But they can also be really useful where people still need access to verges or access to green space, and to help preserve the safety of the road network as well. So this approach can be really useful at junctions, along sight lines and safety areas. So your verges, you can really help to deliver safe roads with those wonderful biodiversity benefits as well. Then the second of 3 tips is around sort of framing those verges. This can again help to tackle some of the negative perceptions that grassland has just been left or neglected, and can also help to communicate the changes in management regimes. And what we mean by framing is really just cutting the first edge or the first mower width of a wide verge or a bit of grassland or a bit of green space. And this, it might seem very simple, but just by framing it like that can help to show people that the management is intentional. The longer grass just it's not just being left and it hasn't been neglected, but this also has 2 really important benefits. It also helps to keep roads safe. It preserves that visibility, those sight lines and safety areas to ensure roads are safe, but it also creates a wonderful structural diversity in the verge. So you have some shorter vegetation and longer vegetation, and this is really important to get a mix across your verge. It's great for the different sort of plants that might grow, but it's also great for all of the bees and the bugs that might overwinter in your habitat or need that sort of grass spaces for development of larvae or things like that as well. And then the last sort of top tip to share with you really is around the sort of communication and engagement, which are so important. It's so fantastic to see the growing awareness and interest in the natural world, especially at the moment. And there are changing attitudes around the neat and tidy. A few of the councils we work with have said to us in the last year or so that more people are now coming to them complaining because they've cut down verges compared to asking them to cut more. So there's that tipping point is starting to happen. But there are still negative perceptions around wilder verges, especially when you have that transition of management and you're starting to decrease the nutrients in your verge. You might not be there in the first year. So communicating that change is happening can really put people at ease, but it can also help to engage people in the process as well. So whether you're a council doing it or you're a local group that wants to get involved and get more people involved in your local area, using that signage, getting different people involved in different ways. Some of the groups that we work with have held photo competitions of what people can find in their local verges and have shared that. And that works really well. And there's also wonderful examples of where people have really got stuck in and harnessed that local energy and enthusiasm, whether that's sowing wildflower seeds, sowing yellow rattle, which can help to decrease the amount of grass that grows in a verge, or conducting botanical surveys of verges, or helping with collecting the cuttings. So there's lots that can be done in that way too. And then the last thing really is to say, I know there's a lot of guidance out there and a lot of things. It can seem like a bit of an insurmountable challenge, but don't be put off from starting somewhere. And also don't set yourself an uphill struggle when you have tens of thousands of kilometres of verges to manage if you're a big county council, or even within all the verges within your parish. Start by choosing the easiest parts of the network, whether that's some of your flatter, wider verges. Perhaps you could start there, or start to work outwards from some of your top quality verges, your wildlife sites or your protected verges. And when you start restoring those key little stretches of verges, you can work outwards from there to create larger and larger areas of better habitat that's more efficient to manage for a start. But then nature will start to help you. The natural colonization and seeding processes and the spread of the species, these wonderful larger networks and wonderful ribbons of wildlife friendly flower rich verges will start to spread from there. So really, do bring your know-how and your skills and your knowledge, add it, take our guidance as a blueprint and bring your specialist knowledge to that, and make a sort of bespoke management plan that really works for your area, and through doing that and starting to implement this, we will really start to transform the whole of the network and bring back wonderful colour like this to our verges. And at Plant Life, we're more than happy to give advice and to showcase ongoing progress. So please do get in touch with us if we can help at all, or you want any guidance on that. And thank you very much.
Kate, thank you very much indeed. I have to say that our three speakers show us the route to a perfect world. It's a brilliant. Lucy, I can't see you. Oh, right.
Yeah, I'm here. We do have some questions in the Q&A. I wonder, Katrina, do you want to address anything in any particular order?
I'm happy to ask the questions if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that would be good.
So there's one from Nikki Chambers to Robert. You mentioned asking contractors to leave some room for nature. Do you think there's a role for having a nature recovery certified contractor scheme so that councils can specify in procurement contracts?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I've been mortified by the lack of knowledge by a lot of the operators. They're very good with their machines, but they have no knowledge of what it is they're maintaining. So I think there should be a basic amount of knowledge for anybody doing such a delicate job.
Reg, do you want to say something on that too? You had.
No, I was just nodding in agreement, but I do know from in the ARB world that the Arboricultural Association, who have an approved contractor scheme with regards to trees, have been thinking along the lines of doing something within the ARB world. So I would imagine in the ARB world, if they're thinking about it, other contracting schemes might be thinking on the same lines, and I think it's a great idea.
Kate, is there anything coming from the sort of plant life direction in that?
It's a really nice suggestion. Quite a lot of the work we're doing. So the best practice guidance that we put together was actually a sort of cross-sector effort. It involved quite a few of the contractors as well as other NGOs and the big highways agencies as well. So it wasn't a case of just another document from a green NGO. It had that sort of cross-sector buy-in. But a lot of the work that we want to do going forward is to really take, you know, the advice and guidance to the contractors and have those conversations, because they often have the specialist knowledge of carrying out the cutting and all the specialist equipment with the specialist knowledge in the equipment, and sort of marrying that together with the nature side of the advice. I think that's a really big thing going forward. So we're hoping later this year to bring the guidance to life through interactive online training through our website. So that's hopefully something that will sort of start the ball rolling in another direction later this year.
Nikki, do you want to say anything more about that? And can you unmute her, Lucy?
Yes. I think it's a really, bearing in mind that the government has quite a significant green jobs agenda and is pouring a lot of money into nature recovery, I do think there's a real chance to create good quality upskilled jobs and solve some of the capability problems and some of the problems about procurement as well. So if anyone is interested in that from a kind of a parish council point of view, then get in touch with the nature recovery, because I at some stage am happy to put some work into it, and I think it might solve quite a bit of parish council procurement challenges.
Great. So there's a question from Kevin to Reg. Sycamores are fantastic at self-seeding. Should we let them do their thing or pull them out?
Definitely let them do their thing. Sycamore have had a bad rap, and especially with regards to foresters, because for decades they've been considered an invasive species. Because so many trees now are under threat from pests and diseases which are new to these shores, and mainly due to, we think, the warming climate and climate change, that anything that lives healthily here, I think we should be hanging on to. And again, Ted Green, who I spoke about earlier, who champions all things to do with trees, has started to call the sycamore the Celtic maple, to try and give it a PR job and try and make it a bit sexier. I think it's a great idea. And he says that that he thinks perhaps they were actually indigenous, a native plant at one point, and somehow they became not. I don't know how, but if you know Ted, you'll know what I mean. But yeah, no, I think we definitely hang on to sycamore. I think we need them.
Right. Harriet Mogridge says, Robert, what do you think of the government policies elms about hedges?
I'm not that familiar with it, to be absolutely honest, and I'm sorry.
Question for Kate from David Knight. Do you have an exemplar of an English local authority for verge management, and what are they doing right?
Good question. Dorset, and I've mentioned them quite a few times, but they're doing a lot right at the moment. I think about a third of their network is currently on cut and collect rather than cut and drop. They're really started to sort of transform the sort of urban network and are moving that out to rural. And another example, just recently, a recent announcement from Cambridge County Council. We and other NGOs have been in sort of discussions with the highways and ecologies team there in the last year, and they've put together a really nice new management plan, taking our guidance, bringing that into their knowledge of the local flora, of flowering times in the area, and combining that with expanding their protected road veg network, trialing cut and collect for this year. So there are some really positive things ongoing, which is great to see. And there have been, my inbox is overflowing at the moment with announcements from different councils of, we're going to try this, or this is a new announcement for this year, which is wonderful to see. And it's that merging of people power from the ground up with the sort of decision makers finally making more decisions, and this is making sense. So it's wonderful to see.
Fantastic. Well, we're sort of at 9 o'clock, so I'm going to hand back to Charles just to round us off. Just there's one thing from Emily Cohen in Islip saying, are there any parish councils who might be interested in sharing costs of machinery? So put it in the Q&A if you are. And also, actually, just one more thing, Robert's idea of hedgehog highways and hedge highways. The Wild Oxfordshire, who's the most fantastic county level network, has got for our nature recovery network 1.2 kilometres of hedgerow to plant next winter. So if there are any parishes around Ensham or on the call who would like some hedgerow trees to start doing what Robert is telling us to do, to make hedgerow highways as well as. Over to you, Charles.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It just remains for me to say that I am overwhelmed really by the dendrophile that Reg is, overwhelmed by yet again by the hedge highways of Robert, and Kate's wish to bring back a little bit of colour, especially I might say to say the A40. This is the week that Oxfordshire County Council have agreed to planning for, inverted commas, improvements on the A40 and a bus lane. These are 3.5 miles long. The biodiversity net loss is over 20. and they are cutting down or destroying 35% of the hedges and 67% of the trees on the road. And they don't seem to see any reason why that could be improved. So maybe there's none so ignorant as those that don't hear. I will just leave it anyhow with saying thank you very, very much for a very interesting and overwhelming evening, and take care.